Chapter 2. Saturday afternoon. By the time Doreen woke up from her nap, her animals were curled all around her, as if understanding how badly hurt she was. Tired as well, she'd be happy to have a few days with no cold case to contemplate. Sure, getting hurt was her own fault, and she'd be the first to admit it, but when things came to a crunch, they seemed to always come to a crunch on her. Mac was right. She kept getting hurt. She had to figure out how to close these cold cases without the same ending. The trouble was, when she talked about putting people away for life, not one of the suspects wanted to walk that path happily. They all tried at the very end to grab that last hope for a bit of freedom. She understood it in theory, but it sucked in real life. Groaning, she rolled over, spent the next few minutes cuddling the animals, telling them how much she loved them and loved having them in her life. Then her gaze caught sight of the time. It was afternoon already, and as far as she knew, it was still Saturday, which meant Scott should have been here already or would be at any moment. She took a deep breath and slowly sat up. The room spun a little, but it wasn't too bad. At least her head didn't boom. She walked into the bathroom and cried out in surprise at her face. She had blood along her temple and something on her cheek, which she scrubbed at. It looked like some medication or maybe iodine. She filled the sink with warm water and, using a washcloth, gently cleaned her hair and face as much as she could. Somewhat presentable, if she ignored the couple stitches sticking out of her scalp, she changed her shirt to something that didn't go over her head and hopefully wouldn't get more blood on it. Her jeans were bloodstained too. She stripped out of those and put on leggings. Barefoot, she padded downstairs gingerly, then through the kitchen to the laundry room, and loaded up the washing machine, removing any sign of her rough morning. Her animals had followed quietly behind her. "What's up, guys?" When none answered, she asked again, "Why are you all so quiet?" With an instinctive shake of her head, Doreen felt instant pain because she knew they understood she was injured. She smiled, slowly bending down to pet them all. "I'll be okay. Not to worry. Besides, I'm not so bad I can't feed you guys." After giving them food and moving carefully, she wandered the first floor. She didn't remember Mac leaving, but presumed he had, as the alarms were set on the doors again. She pulled out her phone and sent him a text, thanking him. Instead of texting her, he called her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. "I'm up. I'm downstairs and I'll put on a pot of tea." "What, no coffee?" he asked humorously. "Nope, not today. My head is aching already. Don't think coffee would improve that." "I don't think the headache and caffeine have anything to do with each other," he said. "This has more to do with the pry bar you left on the workbench." "Is that what she hit me with?" she whispered, aghast. "I knew I should have found a storage place for that damn thing." "Are you okay to keep all the tools now, after what happened?" "Absolutely," she said. "It wasn't the tools' fault. Besides, I'll use them eventually." He chuckled. "I guess if I need something, I know who to borrow from. Anytime. I don't even know what half of them are called." "I know," he said. The irony wasn't lost on me. But to think she used one of my own tools. She probably thought it was still hers. And George, up in heaven, was probably rooting her on. "I wonder," she said. From his journal entries, it seemed like he was saddened by everything that came to pass. "I imagine he was. You've been asleep for a couple hours, so don't freak out when you look outside and see cop cars." "Why are cop cars here?" she asked in an ominous tone of voice. "Because they have to go through the garage, looking for forensic evidence. There's your blood and the attempted murder weapon, etc." She groaned and asked, "How long before the media finds out?" "Hopefully not until after Scott leaves." "Any word from him?" As a beep sounded, she glanced at her phone to see a text came in. "I think he's texting me now. I'll call you back." She checked the text and, sure enough, it was Scott, apologizing for being late. "You guys stay inside while the cops are here, okay? I'll be back soon." She walked out to the garage and asked the one officer she knew, "Arnold, how much longer will you guys be here?" Arnold just waved at her and said, "We're almost done." "Why?" "Because I have an antiques dealer coming to look at this stuff." She pointed around the garage. "I need him to have access." "Not a problem," Arnold said. "How are you feeling?" "Like somebody hit me over the head with a pry bar," she said with a wince. "And by the way, where is that?" "It's in evidence." She sighed. "I don't really need it for anything, so whatever." She caught the grin that flashed on his face, but he immediately schooled his features into looking sorry for her. She smiled at him. "I know," she said. "I'm not badly hurt. Besides, it's worth it. An awful lot of people will get some closure now." "We didn't even know we needed to find closure for some of these deaths," Arnold said with half a snort. "What the hell did we do without your help before?" She thought she heard a really heavy note of sarcasm in there, but she hoped he didn't mean it, because she wasn't feeling well enough to deal with it. "Just so long as you realize I'm not doing this on purpose." At that, he burst out laughing. She glared at him, her hands on her hips. "I don't deliberately walk into dangerous situations, you know." "But you do," Arnold said. "And you keep doing it time and time again. On the other hand, the community thanks you. Not one of us would have thought Penny had ever committed murder, or even attempted a murder." "What about George?" Arnold shook his head. "He was the biggest teddy bear anybody ever knew." "Which is, of course, why he did what he did," she said gently. "He was trying to protect Penny." "But the nurse?" "Once you go down that path," Doreen said, "I guess every other murder gets easier." And in this case, once again, George was trying to protect Penny. Because the nurse would likely have blackmailed George or confessed and created all kinds of problems. "So then why didn't George go after Hornby?" Arnold asked. Just so many unanswered questions. "George didn't go after Hornby because I think by then, George was completely racked with guilt. He knew he was dying, and he wanted to make good so he could go to heaven," she said quietly. "And knowing he had done so many wrongs, he spent the rest of his life trying to do some rights. And when trying to save Penny, in his mind, then death was justified, but he didn't have any reason to kill off Hornby. And yet Penny had no problem with it." "Well, she blamed Hornby for George's death," she said. "After Hornby had blackmailed George, he got serious about committing suicide." "Any idea what he used?" "A lot of plants are in their garden," she said, "many of them lethal." Arnold stopped, peering around the garage into her backyard garden, and she nodded. "I have a lot of lethal things growing in my garden too. But so do you, and you don't even know it." She chuckled at the look on his face. She waved her arm at the furniture. "I just need to make sure the appraiser can take a look at all this." Arnold stepped closer, looking at the contents with a confused expression on his face, and she shook her head. "You know as much as I do. For all I know, none of this is worth anything, and it's just great-looking junk. But until I know, I don't want anything damaged." Thankfully, the officers were already packing up their equipment and loading their vehicles. She smiled and waved as they took off, muttering, "I don't have a death wish, you know." They hadn't been gone more than a couple minutes as she stood, her face tilted up into the sunshine, before Scott drove up in a rental vehicle. He hopped out and said, "Now that's what I like to see, somebody doing nothing but enjoying the day." She didn't dare tell him what her morning had been like. "Nice to see you again." "I hope it's for all the right reasons," he said, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know," she said. "We emptied the garage of junk and hauled that away, and then we moved up as much as we could from the basement into the garage, but the basement is still full too." Scott stepped forward, his gaze going to the set of coffee tables and 2 pot chairs. His eyebrows rose and he said, "Well, this isn't quite the same quality or value as the set we already took, but this set will fetch a very nice penny." She winced. "Could you be a little more specific?" He chuckled. "I have to go over all the pieces to be sure." He walked around, counting. "This is what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces here. 4, 5, 6 pieces," he corrected himself. "Maybe 40,000 at the end of the day." She just stared at him. He said, "I know that's not as much as you would have liked." "It's a lot more than I had thought to get," she corrected. "So selling this set is an absolute yes." He nodded. "Good." He took some photos and made some notes. "What else have you got?" He wandered around. "This dining room table is easily 17,000. The fact that you have 6 chairs with original covers on them," he said. "Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to sell it?" "Let me tell you right now that if you want anything here, you can have it if you can sell it for a decent price," she said. "I know some very high-end furniture would easily cost 17,000, but I'm not living at that level anymore. So if you can get 17 for this set, please do it." "Oh, that's what you'll get. We can probably sell it for 23 or 24. Maybe higher." And at that, she just wandered behind him as he went through piece by piece by piece. He turned, looked at her with a happy smile, and said, "Well over $100,000 worth is sitting here in this garage." "How much?" she whispered. He repeated, 100,000. "It depends on what we can do. These are cherry, specially made, and that maker's mark says they were done for a special occasion. I'll find out how and why and for whom, but just the fact that you have all the chairs in the set. The set almost always had 6 or 8. You've got 6. I can't guarantee there aren't more in the house or in the basement," she said. "Good." After that, she wandered around in a daze as he finished up in the garage. Before going to the basement, she took him inside to the living room and the dining room, where she'd stacked up more furniture. He pointed out the 2 chairs that went with the set. "Perfect. We'll take those 2 as well." He looked at the others, shrugged, and said, "I really don't know what these are or these, unless we can find a few more pieces of it in your basement maybe." He took some photos, and just as she led him to the basement through the double doors connecting the 2 rooms, she got a beep that another text had arrived. She looked at it. "Mac." She called him and said, "Hey, Scott's here. We're going through the stuff in the garage and the house, about to take him into the basement. Does it look good?" "No," she said, "it looks freaking fantastic. And I still want to know more about the footprints." He groaned. "You know what? I'll just go to the library and waste hours and hours looking this stuff up. I'll give you what was released to the press," he said, "but that's it. The child was never found." "Really? No body?" "None." "Send what you can to me," she said, "and I'll give you any further details from here, but I've got to go." She hung up on him, and with Scott's quizzical face, she smiled and said, "Just a case I'm helping the police out on." She led the way down the stairs to the basement, where the rest of the furniture was stored. Scott stopped halfway down and exclaimed in amazement. She pointed to the far back corner where the tall boy was. "I can't guarantee it's what you're looking for," she said cautiously, "but I'm hoping it's the missing piece from the set you took out of here." He beelined for it and stood several feet away, studying it for a long moment. Then he turned happily and looked at her and said, "You remember how we checked?" "I wondered if it might have secret drawers," she admitted. "But I didn't want to try to open them and break something." Now that they were standing right in front of it, he reached around it. "I looked it up and this one is right here." He pushed something on the far back, and instead of a small drawer, a long and skinny drawer opened from the side. She cried out as he lifted up a long strand of pearls. She held out her hand for them and stared in amazement. These are real, aren't they? That, my dear, is not my field, he said, but they sure look good to me. He grabbed something from the drawer. And here is a small note too. Of course it was in the same feminine handwriting, presumably her great-great-grandmother's. It was a note about how she got the pearls as a gift from her husband, on the birth of their first son. Doreen smiled and said, I'm so grateful you found these drawers. I haven't even had a chance to see what's in the big drawers. We worked all yesterday and this morning to get access to the pieces down here. Scott looked around and nodded. I can't believe your grandmother had so much furniture stored away. Neither can I. Doreen motioned at the dresser and asked, Is there a second drawer? There definitely is. He popped open a similar drawer along the other side. Doreen smiled when he pulled out a long velvet bag. She held out her hand, amazed to see the dark green velvet. She opened up the end and carefully emptied the contents into her hands. A long jeweled necklace. She whispered, It can't be real. Surely these jewels can't be real. Scott lifted the strand of green stones and said, This is a gorgeous emerald necklace. She looked down at the rest still in her hand. A matching bracelet and 2 earrings. She wanted to cry for joy for that connection to her ancestors, more pieces of her family's history. There was also a crumpled piece of paper. She held it up and read it. For the birth of our first daughter. He smiled and said, You don't see gifts like that anymore. Now a wife is likely to get flowers for the birth of a child, but certainly not gems like this. Doreen smiled, gently placed everything in the velvet bag, and wasn't sure she could sell any of these. These were part of her family's history, an emotional and happy memory from her family. Something now very dear to her heart.